By the late 1870s, the City of Glasgow Bank had grown into one of the most visible financial institutions in Scotland. Founded in 1839, it operated across more than 100 branches and held deposits from tens of thousands of customers. Its shareholders were not wealthy speculators. According to contemporaneous accounts and later parliamentary testimony, the register included retired ministers, school teachers, small tradespeople, and the widows of professional men, people who had bought shares in a reputable local bank as a form of safe savings. That 4-decade reputation was the foundation on which everything that followed was built. At the center of what would become the greatest Scottish banking disaster of the 19th century was a pattern historians describe as connected lending. According to S.G. Checklin's History of Scottish Banking and Court Records from the subsequent criminal trial, the bank had extended enormous unsecured loans to a small cluster of merchant firms with close personal ties to its own directors. Among them were Smith Fleming and Company and James Morton and Company, while 2 other connected firms were linked directly to board members. These loans, extended over years, dwarfed the bank's actual capital. The merchants used the credit to speculate in overseas trade, particularly in American and Australasian commerce, and when those markets turned, the loans soured. Rather than disclose the losses, the directors chose concealment. Court proceedings in 1879 established that the bank's published balance sheets had been systematically altered. Assets that did not exist were entered. Bad debts were carried as sound loans. The practice continued across multiple annual statements, meaning shareholders, depositors, and the public were all reading accounts that bore no relation to the bank's true condition. This was not an accounting error. The criminal trial returned verdicts of guilty on charges of publishing false balance sheets, making it one of the earliest prosecutions for deliberate financial statement fraud in British legal history. On the morning of October 2, 1878, the City of Glasgow Bank did not open. A notice posted at its offices announced that the directors had resolved to suspend payment. Glasgow had not experienced a major bank closure in living memory, and contemporaneous newspaper accounts described immediate alarm among depositors and shareholders across the city. An inspection of the actual books confirmed what the directors had spent years hiding. The bank was insolvent, by a figure that investigators placed at roughly £6 million, a sum that dwarfed its paid-up capital. Here the story took its most consequential turn. The City of Glasgow Bank had been registered under the Companies Act 1862, but critically it had not registered as a limited liability company. It remained an unlimited liability institution, a legal structure inherited from an era when bank shareholders were expected to be wealthy men who could personally stand behind the institution's obligations. Under this structure, each shareholder's private assets, their home, their furniture, their savings, were available to meet the bank's debts in full. The protection that investors in a modern company take for granted simply did not exist. The liquidators calculated that each £100 share carried a personal liability approaching £2,750, a figure cited in parliamentary debates on the subsequent legislation. The bank had 1,819 shareholders. Contemporary accounts collected by historians, including Charles Munn, document the human scale of the disaster. Ministers stripped of life savings, widows left destitute, small merchants driven into bankruptcy. Researchers estimate that the majority of shareholders could not meet the full call, and a significant number were themselves pushed into insolvency. The collapse did not stay inside the bank. It spread by law into the homes and counting houses of ordinary Scottish families. In early 1879, the bank's manager, Robert Stronach, and 6 of the 7 directors faced criminal prosecution at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. The charges centered on the falsification of the balance sheets. The trial attracted enormous public attention across Scotland and was reported in detail by newspapers, including The Scotsman. All who stood trial were convicted. Sentences ranged from 8 to 18 months. The verdicts confirmed what the shareholders already knew. The fraud had been deliberate, sustained across multiple annual statements, and the losses they were now personally absorbing had been concealed from them at every step. The spectacle of ordinary people losing their homes because of a fraud they could not have detected created intense political pressure. Petitions from Scottish constituencies reached Parliament. The case made visible a flaw in British company law that had been tolerable when bank shareholders were wealthy merchants, but was plainly untenable when share ownership had widened to include people of modest means. Parliamentary debates in 1879, recorded in Hansard, show members arguing that the unlimited liability structure had become an obstacle to both investment and public confidence in the banking system, and that something had to be done before the next collapse. Parliament's response was the Companies Act 1879. The act created a mechanism allowing banking companies registered under the Companies Act 1862 to convert their registration and adopt limited liability. Under the new structure, shareholders would be liable only for the unpaid portion of their shares, not for the bank's total debts. The political urgency was plain. The act passed in the same year as the criminal trial. moving through Parliament at a speed that reflected the depth of public pressure. It did not require conversion, but it opened the door, and the banking industry moved through it quickly. In the years that followed, Scottish and English banking companies converted to limited liability status in significant numbers. The change was not merely legal. It restructured the incentives of bank ownership. When shareholders faced unlimited personal liability, only the wealthy could safely own bank stock, and the threat of personal ruin theoretically discouraged reckless management. Under limited liability, a much broader public could invest, but the personal discipline that unlimited liability had imposed was gone. Some economic historians note that this shift contributed to the later growth of formal bank regulation as a substitute for the self-policing that the older structure had once encouraged. The chain runs clearly. Concentrated insider lending created losses the bank could not absorb. Directors chose concealment over disclosure. Years of false accounts allowed the problem to compound unseen. When the bank closed, an unlimited liability structure turned a banking failure into a personal catastrophe for nearly 2,000 families. Public outrage over that human cost forced Parliament's hand. The Companies Act 1879 opened limited liability to British banks. The conversion wave that followed changed the relationship between shareholders and financial institutions permanently, and made the case for the formal regulatory oversight that would grow in the decades ahead. Every time you buy shares in a bank today, your loss is capped at what you paid. That guarantee is so fundamental, it is invisible. The City of Glasgow bank collapse is the event that helped establish it as the norm in British banking. The episode also illustrates a pattern that appears repeatedly across financial history: insider lending, meaning a financial institution extending credit on favorable terms to parties connected to its own management, remains one of the most consistent warning signs in bank failures across centuries and jurisdictions. Regulators in most countries now impose strict limits on connected party transactions precisely because the dynamic that destroyed the City of Glasgow bank has recurred so often. Understanding how legal structure determines who absorbs losses when things go wrong is one of the most practical pieces of knowledge a saver or investor can carry.